Gold has been with us for a very long time. Not just the substance, but the idea too. It appears in myth. Just think of Jason and the golden fleece. In religion, the Israelites and the golden calf. In mathematics, the golden ratio. In our beloved James Bond movies, GoldenEye, the man with the golden gun, and of course the greatest of them all, Goldfinger. It appears in our poetry as well. Steer not too boldly to the deep, nor fearing storms by treacherous shore too closely creep. Who makes the golden mean his guide, shuns miser's cabin, foul and dark, shuns gilded roofs where pomp and pride are envy's mark. It's in one of the most widely respected codes of morality, the Golden Rule. Treat others as you would like to be treated. In many of these cases, gold is a fixed norm or principle. It's something to respect, to venerate even. And historically, this was no less true of the gold standard. So what would Hayek say? I'm Scott Nelson with the Austrian Economic Center and Hayek Institute in Vienna, Austria, and this week we're going to take a look at what Hayek has to say about the gold standard. So in our last video, we talked about the perils of inflation. But thankfully, gold provides a more stable currency, partly because it can't just be printed off at will like paper money. Unless you come across a massive store of gold somewhere in the earth, the supply and therefore the value of gold will stay roughly the same. Moreover, it satisfies the criteria of money. You'll remember we said in our previous video, we said that money is a medium of exchange, a unit of account, something that you use to make payments, and a standard you can hold in reserve to make deferred payments. Now, for much of history, gold was one of many different media of exchange. There was also silver, bronze, copper to a lesser extent. The problem with metals like copper or lead, for example, is that they corrode over time, so they don't keep. And if you want something that you can hold in reserve to make deferred payments, then you want a substance that will keep. But why our fixation with gold? Well, I mean, it's rare enough to be worth something, but common enough, on the other hand, to be used for commercial purposes. And more importantly, perhaps, is that there is pretty universal agreement through much of human history that it's beautiful and luxurious, and therefore useful in the production of jewelry, not to mention art. One of Austria's finest artists in the early 20th century, Gustav Klimt, turned to using gold leaf in the production of some of his most iconic paintings. For all of these reasons, by the latter part of the 19th century, gold had become the standard medium of exchange. Drawing again on Jeffrey Frieden's Global Capitalism, the gold standard was reliable and promoted growth and internationalism in terms of the movement of goods, capital, and people. You didn't need to worry about wildly changing exchange rates. Trade between two countries shot up between 30% and 70% in this period. Financiers were hot on the gold standard too. If you kept to the standard, then that meant that you wouldn't be cowed by any minor domestic disturbance. You would honor your international commitments. The logic of the gold standard was explained already in the 18th century by the Scottish philosopher David Hume in what is called the price-specie flow mechanism. Basically, it works like this. If your country ran a trade deficit, so in other words, you're importing more than you're exporting, then gold would flow out, therefore lowering your country's purchasing power and forcing your national producers to cut prices and wages. Lower prices for your goods would make them more attractive to international buyers, and as they purchased your goods, gold would flow right back into your country, restoring balance. But not everyone was so enthusiastic about gold. Farmers and miners, for example, were more likely to suffer at the whims of international finance. But in general, as long as the world economy was growing, the tension between national and international concerns could be managed. And as Hayek said, there were three important advantages of the gold standard, and I quote, "It created in effect an international currency without submitting national monetary policy to the decisions of an international authority. It made monetary policy in a great measure automatic and thereby predictable." And the changes in the supply of basic money, which its mechanism secured, were on the whole in the right direction. The gold standard didn't require any explicit agreement, and that's the brilliance of it for Hayek. Rather, due to the prejudices of the various countries, it simply proved to be the preferred currency. It's an ideal case of Hayekian spontaneous order. And it had the added benefit of making things rather predictable, which is good because, let's remember, predictability allows you to better plan for your future. This was the first age of globalization, when Hayek's great rival John Maynard Keynes could proclaim, "The inhabitant of London could order by telephone, sipping his morning tea in bed, the various products of the whole earth, in such quantity as he might see fit, and reasonably expect their early delivery upon his doorstep. He could secure cheap and comfortable means of transit to any country or climate without passport or other formality. But most important of all, he regarded this state of affairs as normal, certain, and permanent, except in the direction of further improvement, and any deviation from it as aberrant, scandalous, and avoidable." It was this enthusiastic confidence that led some to declare that the countries were so interconnected and economically interdependent that war itself was now obsolete. But not even gold was reliable enough, or permanent enough, or stable enough to survive the First World War. Now, I've explored Hayek's time in the First World War in another video. After the First World War, though, Hayek consistently argued that the monetary problems of the interwar years were due not to inherent faults of the gold standard, but to problematic monetary policy. He faulted the British, for example, when they tried to restore the pound to its pre-war value, instead of establishing a new parity at its reduced value and ensuring that no further deviations took place. In order to support his argument, he even cited the great British economist David Ricardo as an authority. But this was only part of a larger problem that Hayek saw in the interwar years. Principally, he was concerned with the dangers of the policy of stabilization, namely government attempts to stop prices from fluctuating. For one, Hayek said, the theory of price stabilization was developed for a closed economy. There is, after all, only so much control you as the government have over your economy when it's internationally connected. War debts, of course, were also problematic in that they pushed prices down and led to a contraction of credit in Europe. Hayek's problem here is that he felt prices were being prevented from falling enough due to an expansion of credit, and that this expansion is what led to the crisis of 1929. For Hayek, the problem was that one was trying to overcome the crisis by fighting its symptoms, namely monetary deflation, where the real problem lay in the direction production took in the previous boom. Now that leads us to a discussion of Austrian business cycle theory, which is a whole new can of worms, one that I will open up for you in a future video. Let's stick for the moment to the gold standard, though, where the relevant question becomes, was it even possible to return to a gold standard at this point? Industrial economies had changed post-World War I. Corporations became powerful enough to exercise some control of their prices, so instead of lowering prices, they could just restrict production, for example. As industrial production became more complex, a skilled and reliable workforce became more important. And this factor, combined with the growth in labor unions, made it more difficult to lay off employees. Hayek had hoped that the move to abandon the gold standard would be a passing phase, and so he was worried, for example, in the case of the United Kingdom, about the Macmillan Report put out by the Committee on Finance and Industry in 1931. The Macmillan Report was intended to discover the causes behind England's depressed economy as well as devise solutions. The reason Hayek was worried, though, is because what he saw in this report and in Keynes's recently published treatise on money was that there was now a theoretical defense for abandoning the gold standard, which is precisely what the British government proceeded to do a couple of months after the report's publication. Hayek's hopes had been dashed for the next several decades. By the 1960s, in his Constitution of Liberty, we find him confessing to the impracticality of returning to the gold standard. The problem with it, according to Hayek, was that no one country could effectively restore it by independent action. Its operation, after all, rested on its being an international standard. But more importantly, perhaps, it rested on certain beliefs and attitudes that no longer existed. Namely, the general opinion that to be driven off the gold standard was a major calamity and a national disgrace. He was hardly more satisfied with Bretton Woods, the monetary arrangement established in 1944, which aimed at exchange rate stability, the fixing the US dollar to gold at $35 an ounce. In 1969, at a Mont Pelerin Society conference, he comments that 20 years earlier, he lost interest in monetary matters because of my disillusionment with Bretton Woods. I was wrong in my prediction that the arrangement would soon disappear. Its main innovation has been to impose the responsibility for restoring balance in international payments on the creditor nations. This was reasonable in the deflationary 1930s, but not in an inflationary period. Now we have an inflation-born prosperity, which depends for its continuation on continued inflation. Gold, help us all. We're back to the problem of inflation. And the U.S. would end up abandoning convertibility of the U.S. dollar to gold in 1971, effectively bringing Bretton Woods to an end. Much as the First World War effected the transition from a certain world to a chaotic one, so too, in the 1970s, we moved into confusing and turbulent times. Former certainties had been upended. New solutions were needed. In a way, this is no different from any time period in history. History, after all, is always in flux, and we often look for new solutions and forget old things. Sometimes with reason, sometimes with no reason. Does anyone still know, for example, about the golden fleece or the golden calf I mentioned at the beginning? Did you recognize the poem I read in my introduction as an excerpt from one of Horace's odes? Does anyone still watch The Man with the Golden Gun for anything other than Christopher Lee's performance? In any case, with gold no longer an option and amidst inflationary turmoil, Hayek would look to another way of finding stability and true good money. The conclusion he arrived at, ironically, might not appear to be very stable, but on closer examination, it could very well be superior to many of the alternatives. The denationalization of money, which is what we'll look at in our next video. And that's what Hayek would say. You know what's funny about this banner here is that it doesn't matter where you move, his eyes always seem to be following you, no matter where you are in the room. You know, it's one of the most mesmerizing and also creepy things. Anyhow, everybody, thank you for checking out this video. We put a lot of work into these videos, so we hope that you're really enjoying them. If you have been, then please feel free to suggest a topic that you'd like us to deal with in a future video. We take all sorts of suggestions, and Hayek has a lot to say about all sorts of different things. And, most important of all, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with your friends.